faithfully conveying value by interpreting great books from around the world.
Hello, this is Sally Book Talk.
Today, we're interpreting the book Hollywood Past, Part 2 for you. This book details the entire process of the Manson family crimes and trials during the 1960s. In the previous episode, we covered the Tate and LaBianca cases, where a total of 7 people were brutally murdered. We also traced how the Manson family formed and how Manson brainwashed its members, making these young people willing to do anything for him, including killing. Why did the Manson family commit murder? How were they caught? Why did their trial set numerous records in American justice?
In this episode, we'll reveal the answers in 3 parts. First, key witnesses. Second, motives for the crime. Third, the trial.
First up, Part 1, Key Witnesses. How did the police identify the Manson family? In the previous episode, we mentioned that Manson and many family members were arrested twice by police in August and October of 1969 for charges like grand theft and arson. But it wasn't until around November that police identified them as suspects in the Tate and LaBianca cases. A major clue came from Susan Atkins, whom we mentioned before. This 21-year-old girl was drawn to Manson's guitar playing and became his devoted follower. Police were investigating another homicide. During the Hinman case, they discovered Susan was also at the crime scene. The Hinman case occurred before the Tate and LaBianca cases. The victim, Gary Hinman, was also stabbed to death, with blood at the scene. And in mid-October, during a police raid on Barker Ranch, Susan was also arrested. Afterwards, she was detained in custody for suspected murder. Most people would feel heavy-hearted when detained for murder charges, but Susan acted very excited. She'd often burst out laughing or singing, and sometimes dance provocatively without warning.
She told her fellow inmates that she'd met a man who was Jesus Christ, and she unconditionally obeyed his commands.
She also said, "We wanted to do something to shock the world, so that the whole world would have to open its eyes and pay attention to us." Thus, Susan began to confide the details of the Tate case to her fellow inmates. Here, we piece together Susan's and others' testimonies to reconstruct the scene. 4 people went to the Polanski home to commit the murders. Besides Susan, there was 1 man and 2 women. Before leaving the ranch, Manson instructed them on what to do. He also told the girls to remember to leave a sign, an evil one. Susan and the others used pre-prepared wire cutters to cut the phone line at the Tate residence's front gate, then entered. The first to die was the boy who sold radios. He was shot dead when he happened to see the killers as he was going out. Then the killers entered the main house, controlling the 4 people inside with guns and knives, and killed them one by one. The last to die was Sharon Tate. When talking about this, Susan burst into laughter. She told her fellow inmates that Tate had begged her tearfully before dying, "Please don't kill me. I want to give birth to my baby." Susan's response was, "Listen, bitch, I don't care about you at all. You're about to die." The next day, Manson personally went to the LaBianca home, tied up the 2 victims, and then instructed the other 3 who entered the house to kill the LaBianca. At first, the fellow inmates were skeptical about Susan's confessions, but after hearing more, they couldn't help but believe it was true. What terrified them even more was that Susan excitedly said the Manson family had killed far more than the 8 victims from the Tate, LaBianca, and Hinman cases. And they were going to kill even more people. The next target was Elizabeth Taylor. Frank Sinatra, Richard Burton, all these big stars would die horribly. An inmate asked Susan, "What does killing feel like?" Susan replied, "I was absolutely elated. Although I felt tired, I found inner peace. I knew this wasn't just the beginning of Helter Skelter. The world would hear what we had to say." In November, the fellow inmates reported Susan to the police. Meanwhile, the police had also discovered the Manson family's connection to the Tate and LaBianca cases through other leads. For example, 2 biker gang members who had been to Manson's Spawn Ranch heard Manson and other family members bragging about the killings a couple of days after the Tate murders.
Manson's exact words were, "We just slaughtered 5 that night."
In mid-November, 3 months after the Tate LaBianca murders, the case was handed over to the prosecutor in charge, none other than the author of this book, Vincent Migliosi. Creatures MRG. At the time, he was 35 years old and serving as the Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney. And in the author's view, although the police had discovered and arrested some of the killers, they were still miles away from convicting them. Even getting an indictment through the grand jury was difficult. Here we need to explain the grand jury system in American justice. A grand jury typically consists of 23 jurors responsible for determining, before a criminal trial, whether there's probable cause to indict a suspect. The evidentiary standard is less strict than in formal trials, but prosecutors still need to present sufficient evidence. Now,
But at the time, the evidence the author had was insufficient. Much of it was hearsay, which courts generally don't admit.
or listeners who enjoy American legal dramas might often hear lawyers shout in court,
Objection! Hearsay! Hearsay evidence refers to a witness's testimony not based on personal knowledge, but on what they heard from others.
In the U.S., except under specific legal exceptions, hearsay evidence is usually inadmissible. The murder details the female inmate heard from Susan were hearsay evidence. The bikers hearing Manson say, "We slaughtered 5 pigs that night," also counted as hearsay evidence. So to pass grand jury review, they first needed Susan Atkins to testify before them about the crimes. But Susan's testimony alone wasn't enough for conviction. Because American trials have the Aranda rule. This rule states that in joint trials, one defendant's testimony against co-defendants is inadmissible. For example, in the Tate LaBianca case, besides Susan, there were Manson and other co-defendants. Susan saying, "We killed them," including other defendants, couldn't be submitted as evidence. But if she said, "I killed them," that could be used. Similarly, Manson telling bikers, "We slaughtered 5 pigs," was also inadmissible. But prosecutors only needed slight corroborating evidence to validate accomplice testimony, like fingerprint evidence. Now, for instance, Susan mentioned they discarded bloody clothes and guns along the way after the murders. Finding witnesses who saw them or locating these items where Susan described could corroborate her testimony, so the author immediately launched an investigation upon receiving the case, and during this process, he gradually uncovered Manson's motives for the crimes. In the next part, we'll specifically discuss Manson's twisted ideology and helter-skelter. In the LaBianca case, the killers wrote this term on the refrigerator, and Susan called the murders the beginning of helter-skelter. Manson himself told family members before the Tate murders that it was time to initiate helter-skelter. As we mentioned last episode, this term means chaos and disorder, and it's also the name of a Beatles song. And the song's writer, Paul McCartney, said it's about a playground slide, but in Manson's interpretation, it meant Judgment Day and the apocalypse, representing Black people rising up and defeating whites in racial slaughter. So, in 1960s America, racial discrimination against Black people was severe, but Manson's belief didn't mean he sympathized with them. In fact, deeply influenced by Adolf Hitler, he firmly believed in racial hierarchies, with whites superior to Blacks.
Therefore, he opposed interracial marriage, believing Black people's sole purpose was to serve whites.
But Blacks had been oppressed too long, so now it was their turn to seize power. They'd start a revolution to kill all whites.
But Blacks had no experience managing the world, so they'd have to hand control to surviving whites like Manson and his family. In other words, Manson believed he'd be helter-skelter's ultimate beneficiary. Manson's so-called life philosophy was a jumble of distortions from various religions, philosophies, and Beatles songs. For example, he saw himself as a leader who'd reverse Black people's fate and balance everyone's karma. This stole the Buddhist concept, simply meaning the inescapable force of karmic retribution for good and evil. Manson also claimed to be Jesus, saying only those he selected could survive the catastrophe. These chosen ones would multiply in the desert under Manson's leadership until reaching 144,000 people, then emerge to take over the world from blacks. Where did this number 144,000 come from? It comes from the book of Revelation, which mentions 12 tribes of Israel, each with 12,000 people, totaling 144,000. And then, so where will these people hide to survive the apocalypse? The book of Revelation mentions a bottomless pit. Manson believed its entrance was in a cave beneath Death Valley, California, leading to a golden sea. In the Golden Sea, there are rivers flowing with honey and milk. The Spawn Ranch, where the Manson family was finally arrested, was one of their hideouts. It had rugged terrain and poor access, but it was near Death Valley National Park. And, moreover, Manson firmly believed the Beatles were God's messengers, communicating with him through their songs, delivering divine revelations. Among the Beatles' albums, the White Album, released in December 1968, had the greatest influence on him. It was the first double album in rock music history featuring 30 songs. Helter Skelter is one of them. He sings that Helter Skelter is coming.
Yes, it's coming.
Yes, coming. Manson thought this meant the great catastrophe was imminent. Another song on the album is Blackbird. Manson felt this was the Beatles calling for black people to revolt. There's also a song called Piggies, with sound effects of pig snorts. Manson believed piggies referred to the ruling class, like the police, and that the song was the Beatles telling him that black people were about to strike a hard blow against those pigs, the ruling whites. Remember? At the Tate and Lubyanka crime scenes, the killers wrote pig in the victim's blood. Among all songs on the White Album, Manson mentioned Revolution 9 the most, a song without real lyrics, instead mixing various sounds, including people whispering.
BBC speech snippets, classical music, mortar fire sounds, church hymns, baby cries, and more.
The climax of the track features machine gun fire and screams, ending with a lullaby. Revolution sounds a bit strange, but for Manson, what could better signal the outbreak of the apocalyptic war? Jacobson, a talent scout who had dealings with Manson, said that when he first met Manson in the spring of 1968, Manson mentioned the Black-White War, but wasn't fanatical about it. But after the White Album's release in December that year, Manson constantly brought up the Beatles and Helter Skelter. In January the following year, he began preparing for this so-called apocalypse. He led people in designing dune buggies and motorcycles, mapping escape routes to the desert. They even planned to send family girls to work as exotic dancers to earn money and stockpile supplies. But since most girls attracted to him were flat-chested, this plan had to be abandoned. Soon summer arrived, but the violent revolution Manson predicted never happened. Witnesses who had contact with Manson confirmed he said, "I gotta teach the blacks how to do it," or similar statements. However, the author notes that Manson's choice of the Tate house wasn't random. He not only visited Tate's home, but was treated dismissively there. This happened in March 1969, before the Tate murders. About 5 months earlier, Tate's landlord, Rudy Altobelli, was home. He rented the main house to Polanski and Tate, living in the guest house behind. One day, Manson showed up uninvited, claiming to seek financial backing from tenants for his album. Altobelli, a celebrity agent himself, dismissed the mediocre Manson. To reach the guest house required passing through the main house, where Manson's snooping caught a friend's attention. That friend treated Manson rudely, and Tate was present, so the author believes Manson's targeting wasn't coincidental. For the Lubyanka case, Manson had visited the victim's next-door neighbor 5 or 6 times, even attending LSD parties there. On August 8, 1969, Manson told the family, "Now is the time for Helter Skelter," leading directly to the Tate and Lubyanka murders. After killing the Lubyankas, Manson ordered the victims' wallets taken and discarded, hoping they'd be found by black people. This would make police think black perpetrators committed the murders,
igniting racial conflict.
On December 5, 1969, Susan Atkins testified before the grand jury in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. While recounting the crimes and answering prosecutors, her expression remained cold and detached, without a trace of remorse. Jurors watched Susan in disbelief. Beyond her testimony, author Bugliosi provided additional evidence. For example, 2 fingerprints were found in victim Sharon Tate's home, one belonging to 24-year-old Charles Watson and the other to 21-year-old Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia Krenwinkel, they are all members of the Manson family.
Based on this evidence, the Los Angeles County Grand Jury agreed to indict Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and 6 others, charging them with murdering Sharon Tate, the LaBiancas, and 7 victims in total.
On July 24, 1970, the Tate-LaBianca case officially went to trial. Among the 6 defendants, Watson, who left fingerprint evidence at the Tate home, was arrested in his home state of Texas and should have been extradited to California for trial. But due to political reasons, his extradition was delayed indefinitely, while the other 5 defendants were either arrested during earlier police raids on the ranch or captured later after being wanted. And therefore, the formal trial was against the 5 defendants, excluding Watson. This trial lasted 9.5 months, longer than any previous trial, to the point where some jurors lost their jobs after it ended. Before and during the trial, the Manson family pulled all sorts of tricks inside and outside the courtroom to exonerate Manson, even sacrificing other defendants. What tricks did they use? In part 3, we'll discuss specifically. The first trick was changing lawyers, as each of the 5 defendants had their own attorney. Although the charges they faced were largely the same, each played a different role in the murders. The evidence against different defendants varied in strength. Each lawyer should fight for their client's best interest, which could harm the family leader Manson's interests. For example, if a lawyer proved their client was mentally controlled by Manson, that would work against Manson. So whenever a lawyer made or intended to make moves that might hurt Manson, Manson would order other defendants to replace that lawyer. A replaced lawyer said their client was tightly controlled by Manson and the family, not caring at all about facing the death penalty. Their mind was only fixated on staying with the family members. The Manson family's second trick was to turn Susan against the prosecution. Susan was the prosecution's most crucial witness, and although she agreed to testify before the grand jury under her lawyer's persuasion, the author constantly feared Susan might back out, as she was one of Manson's most loyal followers. Once, Manson told Susan he wanted a coconut, ordering her to get him one even if she had to go to Rio de Janeiro. Susan immediately bolted out the door, without hesitation. Sure enough, before the trial, Susan suddenly requested to meet Manson. During the meeting, Manson asked Susan, "Are you afraid of the gas chamber?" Susan smiled and said she wasn't afraid. The two then spoke in code for over an hour. The next day, Susan fired her lawyer and issued a pre-trial statement recanting her grand jury testimony. This violated her agreement with the prosecution. If convicted later, the prosecution would seek the death penalty instead of the agreed life sentence. But Susan didn't care. Her sudden reversal cost the prosecution a key witness. Fortunately, another defendant, Linda Kasabian, agreed to testify.
To the prosecution, Linda was a better witness than Susan. While involved in both murders, she only drove and destroyed evidence without killing and felt genuine guilt, unlike Susan's cold, laughing descriptions.
Linda often testified with tears in her eyes. Gentle and impressionable, she'd only been with the family about a month. The author believed Linda's key difference was knowing she couldn't kill. After the murders, she escaped the family.
Later, after an arrest warrant was issued, she surrendered voluntarily, providing crucial details to prosecutors.
For witnesses like Linda, the family used their third tactic: personal threats. Though Manson and key murder participants were jailed, many family members remained free. After Linda became a prosecution witness, a family member nicknamed Gypsy told Linda's lawyer, "If Linda testifies, 30 people will take action." She also urged Linda to commit perjury,
claiming she wasn't present either murder night. Many witnesses received death threats. One key witness's home mysteriously caught fire, nearly killing them.
Another 19-year-old Barbara Hoyt was given an LSD overdose by family members in a hamburger, causing her to run wildly through streets until collapsing, hospitalized. Clearly, the poisoner intended to kill her. As the trial progressed, Manson and others began to display their violent nature in court. They frequently caused disturbances in court. When ordered to leave by the judge, Manson would flash a creepy smile at spectators, saying, "You're about to be destroyed. This is your fate." The presiding judge was attacked by Manson with a pencil in court. The author's home phone often rang late at night, hanging up when answered. Several times when leaving the courthouse, he was followed by family members. The author and judge needed bodyguards. Manson directly threatened, "I'm gonna kill Bugliosi and the judge." Manson was enraged because the author worked hard to prove family members were controlled by him, especially since Manson wasn't present at the Tate crime scene. But Manson's control was evident. Before trial, he carved a bloody cross on his forehead. Days later, 3 female defendants, excluding Linda, branded cross with hot hairpins, even picking at burnt flesh to make them more visible. Family members outside court followed suit. Manson declared, "This means I've X'd myself out of your world." To the author, this precisely proved Manson was the family's leader. Whatever he did, members imitated him. The family's violence terrified witnesses and even their own defense lawyers. But this backfired, helping the prosecution gain a key witness. This witness, Juan Flynn, had worked at Spawn Ranch before the family arrived, a tall Panamanian cowboy. Manson tried persuading Flynn to join, promising a diamond-studded gold bracelet and leadership role.
But Flynn refused to work for Manson.
Once, enraged, Manson grabbed Flynn's hair, pressed a knife to his throat, saying, "Don't you know I killed those people?" Before that, Manson told Flynn, "We gotta kill some damn pigs to show the blacks how to do it." Additionally, Manson repeatedly threatened to kill Flynn and urged him to murder others. Fearing Flynn might testify for the prosecution, Manson family members took turns threatening him, sending threats and harassing calls. Others drove past Flynn's trailer at night, making pig snorts or shouting "pig" from their cars. This left Flynn paranoid but furious, driving him to contact the author and vow to testify. Above, we covered the tricks the Manson family played inside and outside the courtroom. During trial, the author also faced defense lawyers, most despising Manson's attorney, Irving Kanarek. In the book, he fiercely criticizes Kanarek. Per the author, Kanarek specialized in derailing trials with absurd objections and interrupting witnesses. For example, he objected to a prosecution witness stating their own name, arguing it was hearsay since they first heard it from their mother.
He once dragged a simple theft trial for 3 months, wasting $130,000 in taxpayer money.
The theft involved only $100 and normally took hours or a day to try. End of story. A judge privately called Kanarek's style endless questioning on the most trivial, irrelevant details.
Speaking in circles just to confuse everyone in court.
One prosecutor resigned upon learning Kanarek was defense counsel, saying, "Life's too short." Undoubtedly, Kanarek repeated these tactics in the Tate trial. He constantly interrupted prosecution arguments and witnesses, even calling them crazy. Such misconduct got him cited for contempt multiple times. Kanarek's tactics directly contributed to this case breaking U.S. judicial duration records. On January 25, 1971, the jury convicted Charles Manson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten of first-degree murder. Defendant Linda Kasabian received immunity for cooperating with police, satisfying prosecutors. Though arguing Manson-controlled members, the author acknowledged other defendants' bloodlust, voluntary participation evident in the killing's brutality, so they couldn't be exonerated. The verdict also had an element of luck. For example, the evidence against Patricia was pretty weak. The key to conviction was that Patricia wrote Helter Skelter in blood on the LaBiancas' fridge door, and she even misspelled it. So the prosecution asked her to provide handwriting for analysis, but Patricia refused on her lawyer's advice, and that refusal became the only independent support for the testimony, accusing her of murder.
Apparently, her lawyer didn't know that the LA police back then were basically useless at handwriting authentication.
If the police analysis failed, legally, the court would have had to declare Patricia not guilty in the LaBianca murders. California trials are split into two parts. The first phase is the guilt phase. With Manson and the others found guilty, the trial moved to the second phase, the penalty phase, where they decided whether Manson and crew would get death or life sentences. In this phase, the female defendants first all lied under oath, clearing Manson by saying he never mentioned Helter Skelter and claiming Linda, who later helped the prosecution, was the mastermind of both murders. Then, their defense lawyers tried to get lighter sentences by arguing insanity. If a defendant couldn't realize their actions were wrong due to mental illness or defect, they could be legally declared insane at the time of the crime, but there are principles for defining insanity. If a defendant just believed their actions weren't wrong, that doesn't cut it. Otherwise, anyone could say, "I think killing is fine, go murder people on the street, and get off easy." The key is whether the defendant knew society viewed their actions as wrong. And in the Tate LaBianca cases, the defendants cut phone lines before the crimes, wiped fingerprints after, and ditched evidence like the guns they used. This shows they knew killing wasn't socially accepted and understood the consequences of what they did. On April 19, 1971, Manson and 4 other defendants were sentenced to death. Watson, the accomplice, who couldn't be tried with them due to extradition issues, was also convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in October 1971. Before that, he tried faking insanity to dodge legal punishment. In August 1971, 6 core Manson family members robbed a gun store and engaged in armed confrontation with police. They planned to hijack a commercial airliner with stolen weapons, killing 1 hostage every hour until Manson and other jailed family members were released. Most robbers received life sentences. Afterwards, most ordinary family members scattered. In February 1972, California abolished the death penalty, commuting Manson and other sentences to life imprisonment. Upon hearing the news, Manson laughed triumphantly. In 1986, with a cellmate's help, he published a book hoping to convince people the murders were the girl's idea. In 2017, 83-year-old Manson died in prison, leaving unresolved mysteries. One was the death of Ronald Hughes, defense attorney for defendant Leslie Van Houten.
He vanished mysteriously during the trial.
Months later, his body was found in a stream 200-plus kilometers northwest of LA. The cause remains unknown.
Per LA Times reports, Hughes told close friends before disappearing that he feared Manson. Beyond Hughes, the author believes several other murders may link to the family, but lacks sufficient evidence. For decades, fascination with the Manson family hasn't faded. Manson received countless letters in prison, mostly from youth hoping to join the family. Manson print t-shirts remain hot sellers. Many bands, including Guns N' Roses, have covered his songs.
Why does the Manson case hold such immense influence?
One interpretation, it marked a societal watershed, ending the hippie era of love and peace. A hippie told the New York Times, "If you're young with a beard or long hair, you'll never hitchhike again."
Drivers would assume you're a murderous cult member and speed away. But the author argues hippies championed peaceful solutions while Manson embraced violence and murder.
Surveys then showed most hippies opposed Manson. He embodied humanity's dark side, yet people remained drawn to absolute evil. As George Orwell noted in Decline of the English Murder, people relish reading sensational murders in cozy parlors. Perhaps why Manson endures. So what are your thoughts on this topic? Feel free to leave us a comment below. That concludes our interpretation of Hollywood Past Part 2. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.